Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
I'm going to talk about growing older in traditional societies. The subject constitutes just one chapter of my latest book, which compares traditional small-scale tribal societies with our big modern societies with respect to many aspects of society, such as growing older, bringing up children, health, dealing with danger, settling disputes, religion, and speaking more than one language. All of us here today are accustomed to living in big industrial societies, in permanent housing with centralized governments to make decisions, with writing and books and the internet, where most of us live past age 60, where we encounter daily hundreds of strangers, as I'm now encountering you, and where most of us eat food grown by other people. We forget that all of those things arose very recently in human history. Humans have constituted a separate line of biological evolution for about 6 million years, but almost all of those things that I just mentioned didn't exist anywhere in the world 11,000 years ago. And some of them, such as the internet and the phenomenon of most people living past age 60, arose only within the last century or couple of decades. Until Europeans began to expand around the globe 500 years ago, tribal societies still occupied large parts of all the continents. But tribal societies have recently been coming under the control of modern societies with state government, to the point where today the last tribal societies, not yet under state control, are confined to small areas of New Guinea and the Amazon basin. Those tribal societies, which constituted all human societies for most of human history, are far more diverse than are our modern big societies. All big societies that have governments, and where most people are strangers to each other, are necessarily similar to each other and different from tribal societies in many basic ways. Tribes constitute thousands of natural experiments in how to run a human society. By examining what actually does happen or what did happen in traditional societies that are much more varied than modern British society, we may be able to learn things of practical use to us in deciding how to raise our kids, how to treat our older people, how to remain healthy, and other things that we care a lot about. Tribal societies shouldn't be scorned as primitive or miserable, but also they shouldn't be idealized as happy and peaceful. When we learn of tribal practices, some of them will horrify us, but there are other tribal practices which, when we hear about them, we may admire and envy and wonder whether we could adopt those practices for ourselves. Let me tell you the opinion of a Fijian friend of mine. There were some things that my Fijian friend admired about the U.S. and other things that he disliked, but what he most loathed about the U.S. was our treatment of older people. He almost shouted at me indignantly, "You Americans throw away your older people." By that he meant that most old people in the U.S. end up living separately from their children and separately from most of their friends of their earlier years, and often they live in separate retirement homes for the elderly. In Fiji and other traditional societies, older people instead live out their lives among their children, their other relatives, and their lifelong friends. Nevertheless, the treatment of the elderly varies enormously among traditional societies, from much better to much worse than in our modern societies. At the worst extreme, many traditional societies get rid of their elderly in one of 5 increasingly direct ways. The most indirect method is just to neglect the elderly and not to feed them or clean them until they die. The second method is to abandon them when the group moves. The next method is to encourage older people to commit suicide. A fourth, more direct method is to kill older people with their own cooperation. For example, among the Kowloon people of Papua New Guinea, on the southern watershed of New Britain, a widow whose husband had just died, until around 1957, asked her brothers or sons to come strangle her. And the fifth and most direct method of getting rid of the elderly is to kill them without their consent or cooperation. In what tribal societies do children abandon or kill their parents? It happens mainly under 2 sets of conditions. One is in nomadic hunter-gatherer societies that often shift camp. and that are physically incapable of transporting old people who can't walk, when the able-bodied younger people already have to carry their young children and their physical possessions, and so they can't carry an old person as well. The other condition is in societies living in marginal or fluctuating environments, such as the Arctic or deserts, where there are periodic food shortages, and occasionally there just isn't enough food to keep everyone alive. Whatever food is available has to be reserved for able-bodied people still capable of contributing to the tribe's survival, and for children who grow up to be the tribe's future adults. To us modern British and American people, it sounds horrible to think of abandoning or killing your own sick husband or wife or your own elderly mother or father. But what else could those societies do? They face a cruel dilemma. Their old people had to do it to their own parents, and the old people know what now is going to happen to them. At the opposite extreme in treatment of the elderly, the happy extreme, are the New Guinea farming societies where I've been doing my field work for the last 50 years, and the village society, my Fijian friend, and many other sedentary traditional societies around the world. In those societies, older people are cared for, they are fed, they remain valuable, and they continue to live in the same hut or else in a nearby hut near their children, their relatives, and their lifelong friends. There are two main sets of reasons for this variation among societies in their treatment of older people. The variation depends especially on the usefulness of older people and on the society's values. First, as regards usefulness, older people continue to perform useful services in traditional societies and also in our modern societies. One use of older people in traditional societies is that they are often still effective at producing food. Another traditional usefulness of older people consists of babysitting their grandchildren, thereby freeing up their own adult children, the parents of those grandchildren, to go hunting and gathering food for the grandchildren. Still another traditional value of older people is in making tools, weapons, baskets, pots, and textiles. In fact, older people are usually the ones who are best at it. Older people usually are the leaders of traditional societies and the people most knowledgeable about politics, medicine, religion, songs, and dances. That's the origin of our expression, tribal elders. To some extent, that's still true today. The average age of American presidents on assuming or reassuming the presidency is 54 years. Finally, older people in traditional societies have one more huge significance that would never occur to us in our modern literate societies, where our sources of information are books and the internet. In contrast, in traditional societies without writing, older people are the repositories of information. It's their knowledge that spells the difference between survival and death for the whole society in a time of crisis caused by rare events of which only the oldest people alive have had experience. In the US and the UK, we don't rely on oral memory. We instead look up the answers to our questions in a book or we Google it. Among large societies that have had centralized government for thousands of years, there's particular emphasis on respect for the elderly in East Asia, associated with the philosophy of Confucius and his doctrine of filial piety, which means obedience, respect, and support for elderly parents. Cultural values that emphasize respect for older people, such as filial piety, contrast with the low status of the elderly in the United States. Older Americans are at a disadvantage, for example, at getting jobs. Another example of the low status of the elderly in the U.S. is an explicit policy in our hospitals called age-based allocation of health care resources. That sinister expression is a cruel euphemism. It means that if hospital resources are limited, American hospitals have an explicit policy of giving preference to younger patients over older patients on the grounds that younger patients are considered more valuable to society because they have more years of life ahead of them. There are several reasons for this low status of the elderly in the United States. One is our Protestant work ethic, which places high value on work, so older people who are no longer working are not respected. Another reason is our American emphasis on the virtues of self-reliance and independence, so that we instinctively scorn older people who are no longer self-reliant and independent. Still, a third reason is our American cult of youth, which shows up even in our advertisements. Ads for Coca-Cola and beer. Picture them. They always depict smiling young people, even though old people as well as young people buy and drink Coca-Cola and beer. What has changed in the status of the elderly today compared to their status in traditional societies? There have been a few changes for the better, and there have been more changes for the worse. Big changes for the better include the facts that today we enjoy much longer lives, much better health in our old age, and much better recreational opportunities than at any previous time in human history. Another change for the better is that we now have specialized retirement facilities and programs to take care of old people. Changes for the worse begin with the cruel reality that we now have far more old people and relatively fewer young people than at any time in human history. That means that all of those old people are more of a burden on the few young people, and that each old person has less individual value. Another big change for the worse in the status of the elderly is the breaking of social ties with age, because older people, their children, and their friends all move and scatter independently of each other many times during their lives. The average American moves every 5 years. And so our older people are very likely to end up living distant from their children and from the friends of their youth. Perhaps the biggest of all the changes for the worse in the status of the elderly is that they objectively have lost much of the value that they possessed in traditional societies. Widespread literacy means that old people are no longer useful as repositories of knowledge. Finally, the slow pace of technological change in traditional societies means that what someone learns there as a child is still useful when that person is old. But the rapid pace of technological change today means that what we learn as children is no longer useful 60 years later. And we older people are not fluent in the technology that's essential to surviving in modern society. What can we do to improve the lives of the elderly in the U.S. and to make better use of their value? I can offer just a few suggestions. One value of older people is that they are increasingly useful for offering high-quality child care. They've already gained experience from raising their own children. Unlike other caregivers, grandparents are unlikely to quit their job because they found another job with another baby at higher pay. But there's also a downside to grandparents as babysitters. With the increasing age at which couples are having babies today, the couple's parents often don't become grandparents until they're in their 70s and 80s, when they may no longer have the necessary physical stamina to babysit their grandchildren. A second value of older people today is paradoxically related to their loss of value as a result of changing world conditions and technology. At the same time, older people have gained in value today precisely because of their unique experience of former conditions that have now become rare because of rapid change, but that could come back. For example, only British and American people now in their 70s or older can remember the experience firsthand of living through a Great Depression, the experience of living through a world war, and the experience of living through food and gas rationing. Unfortunately, all of those terrible situations could come back. And even if they don't come back, we have to be able to plan for them on the basis of experience of what they were like. Older people have that experience. Younger people don't have that experience. While there are many things that older people can no longer do, there are other things that older people can do much better. A challenge for our society is to make use of those things that older people are better at doing. Older people are better than younger people at supervising, administering, advising, strategizing, teaching, and synthesizing. In short, many traditional societies make better use of their elderly and give their elderly more satisfying lives than we do in modern big societies. Paradoxically, nowadays, when we have more elderly people than ever before, living healthier lives and with better medical care than ever before, old age is in many respects more miserable than ever before. The lives of the elderly are widely recognized as constituting a disaster area of modern American society. They, in traditional societies, essentially never die of type 2 diabetes, heart disease, high blood pressure, stroke, and the other non-communicable diseases that will be the causes of death of most of us here in this room today. Features of the modern lifestyle predispose us to those diseases, and features of the traditional lifestyle protect us against them. Those are just some examples of what we can learn from traditional societies. I hope that you'll find it as fascinating to read in my book about traditional societies as I have found it to live in them.
Do you think in this book you're objective? It's sort of, as I read it, I was struck by East Coast liberal American values. Sort of came out of every chapter. So it just turned out, amazingly, that I bet you believed in a sort of liberal approach to child rearing before you visited traditional societies. And you went all that way to New Guinea and you studied those people and came back and lo and behold, you believed all those American liberal values were supported by what you found. Were you objective in it all?
Was I objective? Of course I was objective. And in fact, a couple of reviewers have criticized my book by saying, Jared, you went all the way to New Guinea to confirm American liberal values. It's more complicated than that. So, some of the lessons are ones that I never would have dreamt of and that we don't think of.
You've been criticized, I mean, you take that view and it's explained in the book, but you have been criticized for, if you like, adding weight to those who would use words like primitive.
I've gotten used to getting criticized by both extremes. It's happened with my previous book, and so I get criticized by people who regard traditional peoples as brutish barbarians who should be killed or driven off their land or conquered as quickly as possible. I've gotten that for the last 15 years. And I also get criticized by people on the far left who have a rosy, unrealistic view about traditional people and feel it necessary to construct a fiction that they're gentle, living in tune with their environment. Traditional people, they're people, like normal people. They're living under circumstances which make it more difficult to control violence, and so the reality, there are a lot of studies of this. There have been quantitative comparisons of dozens of both traditional and state-level societies, and there are 4 people who've gone through all of the numbers, and it turns out that the level of violence in traditional societies is higher than that in state societies. Yes, there are peaceful traditional societies and violent states, but on the average, traditional societies are more violent. Not because traditional people are more evil or they're genetically more violent or anything else. It's because the state institutions are able to declare peace and to declare war.
But a key point would surely be that our respect for traditional societies or our respect of their rights wouldn't depend, would it, on whether they're peaceful or warmongering amongst each other. We would say they've got rights anyway. I mean, it shouldn't matter to us.
That's a key point, and it's a sad key point because it's a trap into which some of those people who share my views fall. The reason why it is loathsome to conquer or drive out traditional people is that it's morally loathsome for any people to subjugate another people. The reason why you should not subjugate traditional people is not that you suppose that they're peaceful. They're not so peaceful as we are, and there are reasons for it. But if you found your politics of defending indigenous people on a factual lie, the factual lie is going to come out, and when it comes out, Brazilian ranchers and others will detect your lie and say, aha, it has now been established that traditional people are more violent, and therefore it is okay for us to go kill them. Instead, policies toward traditional people should be founded on a moral truth, not on a factual, and that's why it saddens me to see the fuss made by some people who share my point of view, who are criticizing my book because they would like to found their policies on a factual lie.
And I was a bit surprised at the fact that they've made an enemy of you rather than thought of you as an ally in that battle. How worried are you about how we live now, about the state? of the world in which we live.
And at the rate we're going now, we're operating non-sustainably. At the rate we're going, we will run out of the world's resources within the next few decades. And so by the year 2050, 13 years after I'm dead, but when my kids will be 63 years old, it'll all get settled whether we've found a sustainable way of operating.
And economists often say, look, the prices will change, the raw materials will become more expensive, the technology will be invested in, and it will be worked out. And that's the sort of optimistic scenario. But do you attach much weight to that optimistic scenario?
A textbook of economics by a distinguished economist said on the title page, in a world of finite resources, the only people who believe that it is possible to sustain growth indefinitely are idiots and some economists.
Can we thank Jared Diamond for a fascinating talk? Thank you. That was great.